Hello, friends. My name is Christina Grozik, and I am with a documentary called Going which is a journey into sound, vibration, frequency, energy, silence, and how it is all connected. So if you're interested in the film, you can always check out the website, goingomfilm.com. Om is O-M, goingomfilm.com. And because those topics are so important, I've decided to continue the discussions on them. Today with me, I'm so excited. I'm on the edge of my seat waiting for these answers. I've got Dr. Roland Mccready with me, and he is the Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the HeartMath Institute. He's been with them since 1991. He is a psychophysiologist and considered an international authority in the field of heart coherence and the impact of emotions on the human psychophysiology. He and his research team have been involved in various joint studies with other academic and medical institutions, and he has been published in leading scientific journals, including the American Journal of Cardiology, the Journal of American College of Cardiology, and Stress Medicine, and the list goes on. So hello and welcome, Dr. Mccready.
Well, good day. Hi, Christina. It's great to be here.
It's so great to connect with you. I know you're super busy. I appreciate you carving the time out and sharing your energy with us today and your work. So many questions to ask you. Where do we start, right? So I have been teaching topics of interconnectedness for some time, especially with sound healing, breath work, meditation, and synchronicity, and helping people find presence, clearing the mental chatter to tap into the answers that I believe we all have. I believe we all have everything we need within us. It's just clearing the clutter and the distractions to find them. And a lot of times people say, I'm not into all of that stuff. And I'm like, what stuff? Energy, your interconnectedness, finding that divine within and that connection within and then with others. So the research you've been doing for the past 30 years and putting the data and the science behind it is so helpful and so exciting. So thank you for all of your work, because now I can say, oh, well, check out this research. And people are like, I'm not into that stuff, right? So I appreciate it personally, and I think it's really helping in a time where we could definitely use it, right?
Yeah,
We can
and
always use it, but I think this is a very critical time for us. So today I want to cover some topics like the collective consciousness. I want to talk about the Earth's geomagnetic field and the relation it has to the heart. The Schumann Resonance and the relation to the brain, the connection there, and then the connection that we have within and how that connection, I think you call it feeding the field, how we can feed the field on a global scale and co-create the world around us. So let's start, maybe with just defining, if we can. I think when people hear the definition of it, they'll say, oh, okay, I know that term. But if they're stuck on that term right now, they can let it go once you define what it is. So you are a psychophysiologist. Can you tell us what that is?
oh, it's pretty simple. Psycho, like psychology, physiology, the combination. So it's really the kind of the study of how our thoughts, emotions, attitudes, and so on interact with our physical body, our behaviors. And, so the interaction between those two worlds. So that's pretty simple.
Dots between the two. Yeah, I love it. I love it. And I think there's been kind of this idea. I think in our society, we look at the brain and we're like, oh, that's where intelligence comes from, right? But I think throughout the ages, whether it's mystics, philosophers, the great religions, they've considered the heart as the seat of intelligence. So can you talk to us a little bit about that and tell us what heart intelligence means?
Okay, I'll do my best here. It's a big topic, but you're right. The brain is, kind of, especially in recent years, since really the 1930s, kind of been the, seat of everything. In fact, it was kind of a paradigm shift in that era where they believed literally that if you could cut the head off and give it all the blood and everything it needed, that it'd be just fine. You don't really need the body; it's just there to carry the head around, right? Nobody believes that anymore. We know that's kind of nonsense. That really the brain is largely interpreting the signals from the body, what's called interoception and what have you. Yeah, certainly I want a brain and I want it to work well. Don't get me wrong here. But you're absolutely right that, in fact, one of our a fellow that used to work here for quite a few years in our education division was had literally 3 PhDs, was a professor from UCLA, and one of his passions was studying world religions. And he basically was very clear that the most common theme of all the world's great religions is the idea of the concept of the heart being the access point to our larger self, to not necessarily mind intelligence, remembering phone numbers and things, but that deeper type of intelligence, wisdom. So they could call it knowledge from the mind, right, and wisdom from the heart, which is one of the common themes. So I would agree with that, and that's certainly what our research supports, and we are HeartMath after all, kind of the study of this. So the way that I would, in a simple way, try to explain it as we have the physical heart, but then there's also the energetic heart, also been called the spiritual heart in ancient more texts and things. So I'm suggesting it's very real. It's not just a metaphor, that it's a very real structure. It just is in an energetic domain that we can't yet put under a microscope, like you can tissues and things. And it's the way to think of it is the transformer, you could call it. The bridge is probably a more simple term between our larger self, and every culture has their own name for it, your higher self, your soul, your spirit. We tend to call it here your larger self, just to take any religious or those kind of connotations out of it. So it's the energetic heart is the bridge between that other vibrational dimension, if you will, of higher intelligence and the mind, brain, body system. So in heart intelligence is the flow of intuitive information from our larger self via the energetic heart down into the mind, brain, heart, DNA systems of the physical body. And we can learn to increase the access to that and live more from that other dimension of intelligence, if you will, by some fairly straightforward and simple practices. Many studies now. In fact, there are over 400 studies, independent studies, in addition to our own, that indicate that when we learn to become more, as in our term, coherent, heart coherent, which has a specific physiological signature to it that we can easily measure, that one of the most common things we hear from people is that increases their access to their intuition. And then the second thing is synchronicities, because as we learn to follow our own inner guidance system, then we are guided to the right place, right time, and meet the right person. That just seems kind of synchronistic, or casual, but it's really guided from that other higher, larger part of ourself. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Makes total sense. Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you're providing tools for people to tap into that, because I think when you are able to tap into that space, that's such a sacred space to be able to access, and the power within that space of just having this whole new world open up to you. It changes everything.
It
It
does.
changes everything.
Yeah. Kind of the say, a change of heart changes everything, right?
Ah, yes, yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah, I love that so much, for sure. And it's really rewarding to see when people are able to access that, the transformations that happen within their own lives. And I
Right.
think when that happens within each individual, they're contributing to something on a bigger scale, which I know we're going to talk about here. So I understand that there's three main categories of the research component. That's the personal, the social, and the global. And I know you've mentioned the coherent side of things right now, and then there's the incoherence. Can you kind of maybe give us an overview of these things?
Well, we probably ought to start with coherence. There's a lot. I mean, most people, I think, have an intuitive understanding of the term coherence. But if you look it up in the dictionary, the first definition is usually around the quality of someone's speech. Hopefully, I am explaining things in a coherent way, right? Had too much to drink and I'm uttering nonsense, you would say I'm incoherent, right? So that's the common street level definition. We probably used it, in our different ways in language. But in ways, in physics, it has similar meanings, actually. But it's always, the term coherence is almost always used. In fact, it's used in every major branch of science. It is a central concept today and anywhere you want to look. And it is used to describe, in a way, the behavior of complex systems. How coherently aligned and how well are the parts of a system working together to give rise to a function or an output that is greater than the sum of the parts. So coherence is a kind of a big umbrella term, and a lot of things under that, like synchronization and harmony and resonance, are all kind of concepts within the larger idea of coherence. So if in a coherent system, or any kind of system, the parts have to be in communication, otherwise they can't synchronize and work together. So inherent in that is a type of communication between the parts. And if it's a coherent system, it means that there's harmony and global order among those parts. Energy efficiency is embedded in it, and as I already said, an output greater than the sum of the parts. So that's kind of what coherence means. So those are things we can measure: the level of coherence or incoherence, how well a system is functioning, all of its parts together. So we can certainly do that at the personal level, the human body level. And I won't go, we could do a whole hour just on what that means, but as it turns out, one of the best ways to measure how coherent we are personally is reflected in the activity of the heart, and actually in our heart rhythms, and the patterns, more specifically, of our heart rhythms. Now, it would take too long to go into all that, but the heart is involved in so many systems in the body that interact with, when it's in a particular rhythmic pattern, that literally means that the activity in our nervous system, our hormonal system, and so on is more in sync. Their systems are cooperating. So when we're in that heart coherent state, it's a very energy efficient state. Now, just part two of that is that the heart actually sends more neural information to the brain and the other way around. Now, that sounds like some new discovery, and people go, wow, and it's actually been known since the late 1800s. This is not a new discovery, just kind of ignored and forgotten, and rediscovery a lot of times. But I'm going to call it here for simplicity, the quality of those neural signals, the pattern of them, has major impacts on brain function. The synchronization of the neural systems in the brain. There are direct neural inputs into like the amygdalas, for example, our emotional centers. So one of the reasons that we would hopefully, I don't know if you're married or not, but whoever you're with, you didn't say, I love you with all my head, right? Right? We have a reason for associating deeper emotions, things like compassion and love and appreciation with the heart, because it's when we're in those feelings, heartfelt feelings of emotion, that changes the rhythm of the heart into a more coherent state. Those going to the amygdala, and it's interpreting those as everything is okay. So in fact, the brain is largely doing that for the external world as well. It's largely interpreting signals and then doing its thing and providing meaning and perception to them. So same thing for the heart. So the heart really is one of the major inputs to the brain. So anyway, that's a little bit off topic of your question, but that's kind of an essence, in a way, of the personal level of coherence and how we would measure that. Social coherence, very similar. In fact, I would say social coherence is the biggest issue we have on the planet right now, with all the polarizations, extreme polarizations, probably more than ever. And so that now we're talking about the coherence of a group, a family, work team, sports team, doesn't matter, any type of intact group or team over time. And what's the stability of those relationships? What's the harmony within the function of the group? And you probably get my gist, and then that's where a lot of our research is focused these days. Basically, we have to learn how to get along with each other, or we'll never reach global coherence, right, where we're really operating globally at a more coherent level. Now, one of the aspects of global coherence, I think you already kind of mentioned in your introduction, is really the study of interconnectivity. Not just how countries and cities, states, countries are getting along, which would be an aspect of global coherence, but the deep fundamental interconnectivity, more at we would call an energetic level. So we could do a whole hour easily on just this topic, but to study that, we have to measure things, right? So we've installed a global network of magnetometers around the Earth that are measuring the Earth's magnetic fields. And so we're able to look at the interaction between changes in what literally resonant frequencies of the Earth's fields and humans. And as it turns out, the heart is one of the major systems in the body that is connected with and synchronizes with the Earth's rhythms, right? And I should also say here, and this is kind of crosses all three domains really, but when we put electrodes on the body to measure the electrocardiogram, I mean, it's called the electrocardiogram because we're measuring electricity, literally. You're measuring current flow when you put electrodes across the chest to measure the ECG or electrocardiogram, or on the brain to measure the EEG, which we do all the time here in the lab. But whenever you have a flow of current, you also you create a magnetic field. Now, a lot of people out of the scientific community don't really understand that electric fields and magnetic fields are very different things. We just call it electromagnetism because one can make the other, but they have very different properties and behaviors. And one of the things about magnetic fields is they radiate, they go through things. Right? And this is why, in fact, my previous career, I was a communication engineer. I used to work for Motorola. So I know a lot about how we use electromagnetic fields to carry information, right? Like your cell phone, right? So kind of an obvious checkout for what I'm saying is your cell phone works indoors, right? Even in elevators. So it's the magnetic component that's really going through the walls and carrying the information, your voice, your picture, whatever that you're wanting to send. Well, as it turns out, we work the same way. So when the heart beats and you measure the current flow, you can also measure a magnetic field using a different device. You have to use a thing called a magnetometer, right, to measure that. And you can measure that many feet from the body. With magnetometers, you can measure a brainwave about an inch. So you can easily see now, energetically speaking, magnetically, the heart's the big radiator. And this has been in our language forever, right? And it seems like the younger generation is talking about good vibes and all this and all the time now, or sayings like the tension was so thick in the room you could cut it with a knife. So we know this intuitively, and about everybody's experienced it. But we were able to, actually it was rather easy to show once we measured the magnetic field that it is literally carrying information about our emotional state. So in short, what I'm really saying is what we feel inside doesn't just stay in the skin. It is literally being radiated, whether we put on the plastic face or not. And then the next step for that was to show that is also detected by our nervous system. It has measurable biological responses. So there's a very real and measurable energetic communication that's always going on between people. So we'd have our personal field environment, but whenever we're in any kind of social situation, two or more, those fields are interacting and communication is going on at this unseen level. Now, taking that to the global level, one of our hypotheses that the reason we have this global network of magnetometers measuring Earth is that we all live within the magnetic fields of the Earth, and that our hearts, our rhythms, well, brains but especially hearts, are connecting with the field of the Earth. So that's what we mean by feeding the field that you mentioned, right? So it's what we feel not only is in our local environment, but also we're all inputting into the larger global field environment. So you can kind of think of it as a global information field that we're all contributing to all the time. So a lot of my message is often becoming, how do we become more responsible for what we're feeding the field? And so what our science and research is showing is that it actually matters what we're feeding the field. So anyway, that was a long answer to your question. So
that was perfect. That was perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. And I mean, it is all connected, like you were saying, and the fact that you have been able to measure it, I think, is outstanding. And it's so important that people can see the data behind it and they can see the science behind it, because I believe this, and throughout the journey of this film, talked to so many different people, and it was interesting because I think the idea and the concept that we are co-creating the world around us through our thoughts, through our words, through our actions, and every single time you have a thought, word, or action, I believe that you have a choice to make as to how you would like to shape the world and contribute to that. So, I know you had mentioned that because it's not just this woo concept, it's literally energy. It's all energy. And you talked about that magnetic field around us and then walking into a room and there's certain places that you really resonate with and they just feel so good, or people that you encounter and you're like, oh, there's something about that person I just really like, and then that works on the other side too, that you go into a place and you're like, I want to get out of here right
Yeah.
now. Or you meet a person and you're like, there's something about them, it's making me very anxious in some way, energy. Energy speaks, I think, before we say a word sometimes, right? So it
Absolutely.
speaks volumes, yeah. So with a person's magnetic field and being able to measure that, does that change? Do those measurements change depending on what someone is going through at the
Oh,
time in their
oh,
life?
absolutely. They rapidly change. Well, it's not that so let's go back to the cell phone analogy.
Okay.
So we're using what you would call a carrier wave, right? The magnetic field, and then you modulate it with information. So we're the same way. So it's the field is the field that we're radiating. So like one of the questions I'm often asked was, does the field get bigger when we're feeling love, right? Well, probably not. But what does change is the information being carried by the field. I mean, if you think back to the cell phone, you can be having a conversation and yelling at somebody and being really nasty, and that's a type of information, a frequency of information, literally a frequency in that case, right? Or you can be telling them how much you love them and you care about them and having a very heartful conversation. So what's changing is the information, right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It does, yes. Yes.
So it's very, very much the same thing as like our cell phone.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I mean, I think, most people have cell phones maybe, so they can connect to that. Every time I come up to a stoplight, I see people on their phones.
Yeah, well, of course.
you know, so yeah, hopefully that's something that people can say, now I get it, right? So let's talk about the connection, because I'm a big proponent, and definitely when I first read, there was a book about Chief Seattle's speech by Susan Jeffers. It's a children's book, but it talks about the interconnectedness of everything, and how can we buy the sky? How can we buy the water? How can we buy because these are all part of us. It's all one. It's all connected. And what we do to one, we are doing to all. And absolutely, when I first read it, I wanted to read it in one of my workshops, and I was crying and sobbing so much that I'm like, I better not read this. And then I kept reading it and hoping that, I could just not cry when I was reading it. So then I took a chance and I read it one day, and I almost got through it, almost. And then it just started falling, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. But, some of the students in the class were crying as well. And I'm like, it's powerful, because you do see, I think it changes the perspective and the lens that we're seeing the world through. And hopefully we can make different decisions based on recognizing now. When you know better, then hopefully you try to do better, right? When you see the
Exactly.
connectedness of everything. So, talking about the Earth's geomagnetic field and the heart, can you explain the relation between those two?
Yeah, let me give it a try anyway. At least on some levels, and a lot of the research that we've actually published in some pretty high-level journals in the last a couple of years, we're really just at the tip, I think, of the iceberg of really understanding the implications of what some of these studies are already showing. Maybe give a little background to help people kind of get what we're talking about here. So if we all know the Earth has a magnetic field, or most people do. The North Pole, the South Pole, what's called the geomagnetic field, thing your compass tunes into, right? That we navigate with and all that. So the Earth's geomagnetic field is basically what's called a static field. It's very much like a magnet you stick on your refrigerator. It's a pure magnetic field generated by, well, we won't need to get into that, but and then it goes out into space thousands of miles, and if you kind of look at it from space, it's like a big donut, what's called a toroidal shape around the planet. And here's the thing. Well, let's invite everybody to travel back to science class, back when you were in, I don't know, high school or whatever. We got to play with iron filings. Remember that? You dump iron filings on a glass plate, and you stick your magnet under it and kind of move it around, and all the iron filings jump around, and they show you in a visual way the shape of the magnetic field, depending upon what type of magnet you have. But the point I want to make here is to remember that those iron filings lined up in lines, little lines, right? closer together, closer to the magnet, and farther apart as they go out. So what you're also visualizing are what are called magnetic field lines. Okay? So the Earth's geomagnetic field is the same way. It has these magnetic field lines. Now what they didn't teach us, at least in our science class back then, was that magnetic field lines can act just like guitar strings. You pluck them and they vibrate. So the field lines can literally vibrate. And it's the same as, well, a guitar. I'll use a guitar, but any stringed instrument, right? The length of the string and how tight the string is sets its frequency, or the note, right? The vibrations, that's the frequency of the vibrations. Well, the Earth's magnetic field lines are really long, right? So they have a lower frequency. Now, what's plucking the field lines of Earth is the solar wind rushing by. If we were doing visuals, I could show you a picture of this. But meanwhile, the Earth is turning, so is the sun and the solar wind. In fact, the solar wind has enough pressure that it pushes in the Earth's magnetic field on the daytime side and stretches it out on the nighttime side. Most of us did learn that back in science class. But anyway, so this turning and the solar wind rushing by is plucking the strings, and the magnetic field lines are vibrating. Now, the technical term for this is field line resonances. Okay, science finally got something simple, the way to describe it. And here's the thing: one of the primary resonant frequencies of the Earth's field line resonances in frequency language is 0.1 hertz. Okay, it's exactly the same frequency as our human heart rhythms when we're in a coherent rhythm, in a coherent state. But all of these frequencies of the field line resonances overlap with our nervous system and heart rhythms. Okay, so then the second set of magnetic rhythms that are a completely different mechanism that I know you want to talk about, that are also important, but at a way to lower magnitude or amplitude of intensity would be the way to think of it, are called Schumann resonances. Now, Schumann resonances are magnetic waves. They're nothing to do with what I just talked about, the field line resonances, that are traveling around the surface of the Earth. So these are waves it's in a cavity that get trapped between the surface of the Earth and the bottom of what's called the ionosphere. So if you're not familiar with the ionosphere, think of it as a soap bubble around the planet. It's a layer of plasma, in other words, a highly ionized kind of state. It's considered the fourth state of matter in physics. And plasmas have a lot of unique properties. One of those is that lower frequency magnetic waves bounce off of them. In fact, this is how, if you're familiar with ham radio operators, or amateur radio operators are sometimes called, this is exactly how it works. You send your radio signal up, it hits the ionosphere, bounces off, and that's how somebody in the United States is talking to people in England or China. And if you get a second bounce, it's how you're talking to people then in Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and so on, which they love to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love your analogies, and they make it very easy to understand, and the information that you presented, and you did it in such a way, because I've read quite a bit about the Schumann resonance, and sometimes some of the language that's used, I'm like, wait a second, what? And then I'm looking up every single term and trying to connect the dots. So you made it very, very simple.
Yeah. So magnetic waves that get created, and larger ones. So lightning is one of the sources. Lightning bolt, you create a big magnetic wave. So the rhythms, the waves that are going around this cavity, and by the way, they're called globally propagating standing waves. And I'll translate that. It means they're everywhere all the time. Okay. If they fit the geometry, in other words, they're resonant, they become these amplified waves. If they're not, they get dissipated and go away very quickly. And here's another analogy to help people get what I mean by that. Everybody knows the pond and dropping the pebbles in the pond and the waves going out, right? So if we drop a pebble in, and we see the waves go out, and we drop another pebble in at exactly the right time, that the waves add, and you start getting really big waves by dropping them in at the right time, right? If we drop them in kind of chaotically, the waves all get, interfere, and this becomes a very choppy, low amplitude mess. Same kind of thing. So it's the geometry. Yeah, and by the way, the ionosphere starts roughly, depending on seasons, about 50 miles up from the surface of the Earth. Okay, so it's a literal geometry that sets the frequency that the waves have to resonate at.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so and there's been a lot in certain social media and things about Schumann resonances in recent years. The first Schumann resonance is 7.83 hertz, which is, for those of it knowing about physiology, that was immediately recognized. And it was first measured, by the way, in 1959, 1960. It was the first time these were ever measured, which is not that long ago when you think about it. And they're called Schumann resonances because Otto Schumann was a German mathematician who predicted these things had to exist. So that's why they got named Schumann resonances. Okay. So 7.83 hertz was immediately recognized as the same frequency as the human brainwave. It's actually what we would call alpha rhythm or low alpha. It's really at that threshold between theta and alpha. It's kind of a key brainwave area. But there are actually 8 Schumann resonances. Not just one. There's at least 8 of. There's 8 of them, right? And we now know all 8 overlap human brainwave frequencies.
Okay.
Okay. So what sets the frequency of these resonances is the geometry, right? The distance between, the soap bubble around the Earth and the cavity between. So there's, it seems like every couple of years somebody makes these crazy claims that the Schumann resonance frequency is increasing, or that for the first time ever we've measured 30 hertz in Schumann resonances. Well, it's always been there since measured in 1960. And just people that have low sensitivity magnetometers in their backyard, start seeing a resonance they didn't see before, and start making these crazy claims because they really haven't done their homework. So these social media things keep going around that are just nonsense. I can guarantee you, we have a global network all around the Earth measuring these things simultaneously, right, feeding back in a time synchronized way, that the Schumann resonances are exactly the same as they were when they were first measured in 1960. Okay. Now they can temporarily change, but they always come back to their base frequency. So they would change if the Earth gets hit with a solar flare, for example, and the ionosphere gets disturbed, and the ion density gets weakened, or these types of things. But they're minor fluctuations. In fact, there's a day-night change in Schumann frequencies of about half a hertz every day and every night. Anyway, so hopefully that's now. Remember, I mentioned, I don't know if this means anything or not, but I think it's really interesting how if we're measuring us, the people or animals, as far as that goes, that if we measure the magnetic field of the heart, it's huge. We can measure it, feet away. Brainwave an inch with the same instrument.
Wow.
The same ratio at the scale of Earth. In other words, the field line resonances, which overlap with the heart's rhythms, are huge compared to the Schumann resonances. It's the same ratio. So the Schumann resonances are really kind of tiny compared to the field line resonances. It's interesting that our hearts and brains have the same frequency at the same kind of ratio difference at the scale of Earth and humans. Now, why is that important? Well, back to science class. If you either didn't get to do it in science class, everybody's seen demonstrations now, especially in a film like yours, I'm sure, where you talk about resonance. So a common example is the 2 tuning forks, tuned to the same frequency, and you tap one, and the other one starts to magically vibrate, right? So that's just demonstrating what's called resonant coupling, to be a little bit more specific. In the case of our tuning forks, you have air molecules that are mediating or carrying the energy between one tuning fork and the other. They're moving back and forth and transferring the energy. And the other tuning fork starts to vibrate. Or guitar strings or anything tuned to the same frequency. So we can transfer energy and information between 2 oscillating systems that vibrate at the same frequency. Okay? Well, it works exactly the same way with magnetic fields, only you don't need the air molecules. Right? How our cell phones work. If you think of it, Christina, and all the listeners out there, just studying around you now, how many of these invisible magnetic waves are vibrating around you? Cell phone conversations down the road, next door, radio stations, TV stations, etc., etc. They're all there now, around each of us and everyone listening. Well, how does our phone or radio, whatever, know which How does it get the information out of all this sea of fields? Well, we quite literally tune the receiver, in this case, to be resonant with that frequency of interest. And as soon as we do that, we easily transfer the energy and information into our device, amplify it, and can have our cell phone conversation. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
exactly how they work, right?
Yeah.
So we in fact, I'm old enough now. You're probably too young to remember this. We used to have radios. You actually had to turn knobs, right? And you're turning a capacitor specifically to tune the resonant frequency of the receiver to the frequency you wanted to receive. So anyway, the principle of resonance means that we can transfer energy and information between different oscillating or vibrating systems. So what I've just told you, in a measurable way, our hearts and brains are vibrating, oscillating at the same frequency as Earth's primary resonant frequencies in two different domains. So we have the basic physics of understanding how we can be transferring energy and information between our hearts and brains to the Earth's larger field that we all live within.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Make sense?
It makes total sense. Yeah, I love the way you describe that, and I think it's so fascinating that we are connected in that way. So the geomagnetic field, our heart is at the same amount of hertz, and same with Schumann resonance in our brain. And those, thank you so much for clearing up to the Schumann resonance theory, right? Because I have seen that all over the place, like people posting like, oh my gosh, or holy moly, or this is happening, and and this is creating this. And so I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I think providing people with a better understanding of it is super valuable, right? Because
Yeah.
it goes back to that energetic side of things, that when you're putting this kind of stuff out there without knowing, right, then you're creating this anxiety amongst people. So
Well, yeah, I think it's a disservice too because the scientific community then writes all this stuff off because we know that that's nonsense. But also keep in mind that we really don't want the Schumann resonances to fundamentally change. So both the geomagnetic field and the ionosphere are critical for life on Earth as we know it.
mhm,
So without these magnetic fields, Earth turns into Mars very quickly. It's the shield that keeps the solar wind from blowing away our atmosphere and the water, right? So because it's the geometry of this cavity that sets the frequencies of it's been the Schumann resonances in this case. If that's changing, it means the dimension of the ionosphere is changing. Not a good thing. It's to have happen. So I think a lot of the confusion that people make is that brainwave frequencies have something to do with consciousness. When we talk about deeper consciousness, I don't mean like awake asleep consciousness now, but of course they do there, but or higher consciousness, or more connecting with our larger self. So I would just suggest that no, it's not a measure of our higher consciousness, that what the Schumann resonances are, or even what our brain frequencies are.
okay. All right. Well, I appreciate you explaining that. I do want to go back. You had mentioned that if there's a major solar flare, then it could go off a little bit. It's normal baseline pattern, right? But one of my biggest teachers have been animals and observing and watching animals. And I know before natural disasters, it's been reported that the animals will normally seek higher ground, they'll get out of the way. And I feel that they are just so more in tune on that dial, right, with what's going on around them. And like you had referred to and mentioned, that just because it's not in our awareness and we aren't conscious of it doesn't mean it's not happening and it doesn't exist around us. Every day I wonder, like, what is going on around me if I feel a shift in how I feel for that day, like, in my mood or whatever, and nothing has happened. I feel that there's something around that maybe I just am not conscious of happening. So if there is a major solar flare or something like that that takes it off base a little bit, does that have any kind of impact on us that you have been able
Yeah. Well, solar flares are obvious, and there's literally hundreds of studies that have shown. Well, I answer this on two levels. Um, well, let me start back with the father of the field of what's now called helibiology. Helo meaning solar, right? In this case, sun and biology. Alexander Chesovsky, who's a Russian astrophysicist, who got drafted into World War I, And so he was keeping one eye on solar activity because that's what he did professionally. But here he is in the middle of a war, right? In World War One. And it occurred to him that when there's higher solar activity, this isn't necessarily solar flares now, but more sunspots and more magnetic activity of the sun. Remember, this is the 1920s, so a lot is not known. The X-rays weren't understood or known about. Gamma rays, none of the stuff we now take for granted was known at that time. But anyway, he observed that during the peaks of the solar cycle, which is a 10.5 to 11-year cycle, that it was affecting people's behaviors. That battles got bloodier. People were just doing crazier things. So it intrigued him. So after the war, he did an exhaustive study of human history and went back as far as that time they had solar cycle, not flare, records for, which was 1749. And he should show if the graph of it, which I've republished in some of our papers, is jaw-dropping when you look, because he actually plotted the number of major human events that happened every year from 1749 to 1926 when he first published his work. Just how many major human events, start of a war, revolutions, big kind of global planetary level events, right? And then he plotted the solar cycle, and they're almost a direct overlay. I mean, it's amazing, the cycle. Now, that's been confirmed many, many times since and brought into modern times. So there's a cycle that we now know that the sun actually does emit more energy during the higher parts of these cycles, just in frequencies that we couldn't measure back then.
And I think I've seen those graphs, and I think they're fascinating. And I can actually include some of this material in the description here for this video. And
Okay, so that
sorry, go ahead.
right, so that's just 10.5, 11-year cycle that modulates all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
Even stock prices and stuff modulate with. It's amazing everything that kind of rides along with that longer rhythm. Now, solar flares is another thing. There happen to be more solar flares during the upper parts of that cycle, and if they happen to hit Earth, which is the sun blowing out massive amounts of plasma, and the solar wind speed jumps way up, and so that's now we've got that the solar wind on a normal day is about 1,000,000 miles per hour, right? When a solar flare happens, it can jump up to 4,000,000 miles per hour even. So remember, that's hitting Earth and causing and there's these big chunks of magnetic stuff called plasma that's also coming along with the solar wind hitting the Earth. If we happen to be in the target of the direction, a lot of solar flares, they miss us. They go off in all other directions and into space. But when they hit us, they cause large magnetic field disturbances. The magnetic field's getting hit, and its normal resonant states are disturbed. Okay, now that's not good for us. And there's hundreds of papers. That's because all researchers have had for a long time is a measure of magnetic field disturbance called KP index or AP index, which is literally a measure of magnetic field disturbance. Okay, and it's kind of crude relative to what we're able to do now. And so many studies have been done showing that when KP goes up, magnetic field disturb goes up, a lot of bad things happen. Hospital admissions for all kinds of things go up. I mean, heart disease and strokes and on it goes, but especially things like depression and anxiety disorders go up. Mm. So it has, we don't like being in a disturbed field that we live within. Mm-hmm. Now, this is given actually the impression that this field stuff is bad for us. It's all they can study. Now that we have our called the Global Coherence monitoring system, our global network, we're able to act. And by the way, the magnetometers that are measuring KP index don't see the resonant frequencies. They're tuned for disturbance.
Oh, okay.
So we're now we have a global system now that's constantly monitoring the resonant frequencies and different levels of them in the Earth's field. And this is what, for people that are interested, a lot of this is all published on, you can go to HeartMath.org website now in the what's called Research Library. There's a whole category for these kinds of papers. But what we're seeing is actually blowing us away. We would never have predicted the degree of synchronization that our heart rhythms have with the Earth's fields on normal days, which is most of the year. I mean, it's rare that we're getting hit with solar flares, actually. But we're very synchronized with the resonant frequencies of the Earth. Now, when we do get hit and the field gets disturbed, that goes away because the field's disturbed. And we don't like that, right? That's not healthy. And then a growing some of our own and other studies are now starting to come up to the same conclusion that a new perspective is emerging, that it's a really good thing to be in sync with the Earth's fields, that it's an actual energy source. Not only the Earth's fields, but also there's this is a study we published in one of the Nature journals that we had people wearing recorders that record their what's called heart rate variability, the beat-to-beat change in heart rate, which is a way of measuring nervous system activity for 5 months, 24 hours a day over a 5-month period. So we're able to see many cycles of changes and really get a very clear picture. And not only when we're in sync is that a good thing, but the sun also emits a thing called solar radio flux, is the term for it. It's a 2.8 gigahertz frequency. It's a very high frequency, kind of a radio wave frequency that the sun's always been emitting, and it also goes along with that same solar cycle, the intensity of it. Well, when that increases, that's actually, we feel better, cognitively perform better, HRV goes up, increases, which is a good thing. So, and also gamma, not gamma, cosmic rays, we all respond very positively to on normal days. So the kind of interpretation that's emerging now is that all of these different all of these different frequencies, if you will, are literal energy sources when we're attuned to them and in resonance with them.
Okay, yeah, that's wonderful to know. Absolutely. So let me ask you this: if so, we can use these and we can harness these, right? And we're feeling better. So does it matter if we're in a state of alignment and coherence, how we utilize
Absolutely matters.
energy?
Absolutely matters. Now, this, like I said, there's more questions have emerged since this newer research than we have answers for yet, kind of showing us our own ignorance in a way about what we don't know. And so I'll say the preliminary data suggests that when people are highly stressed, that we tend to not be synchronized as much. With others, we can also measure heart-to-heart synchronization and with the Earth. But kind of in fact, this was just published a few weeks ago, kind of a major paper in another study we did where people were wearing recorders for a long period. We had groups all around the world, groups of 20 in each group. In Saudi Arabia was a group, Lithuania, New Zealand, UK, here in California. So we were really looking at this was to replicate and extend a previous study that had shown that we are in sync with these rhythms of the Earth at this almost phenomenal and hard to believe level, right? How in sync we actually are. Would never have predicted it. So we extended that study, replicated and extended on a much larger scale at a global level. And I can tell you this is happening globally, not just in California. But in the middle of that study, we actually had all these people around the world do what's called a heart lock-in. This is one of the HeartMath techniques where you are really getting in a heart coherent state and consciously radiating love and appreciation to yourself and others. The simple essence of it. And what happened during that is for 15 minutes, and we're measuring the Earth's magnetic field continuously and their heart rate variability continuously over weeks, right? So on the day that they did that lock-in, we looked at the heart-to-heart synchronization, how in sync are we with each other within each of the groups. So that went way up. They became more synchronized with each other, but they also became more synchronized with the Earth's field for the next 24 hours. So just being coherent in your personal coherence for 15 minutes, you increased social coherence, or in a measurable way, our energetic connection, and our connection with the Earth. That had what we call carryover effect for the next 24 hours in terms of the Earth.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And
That was a good question you asked, yeah.
I'm sorry?
That was a great question you asked, right?
Well, thanks. Well, yeah, I mean, that's incredible that that's happening. And points to so many different things. And, my head's just right now, like kind of racing with all of these other questions. I've had so many questions and you've touched base on almost every question I've had thus far. So thank you for that. So with these things, are there any directions given to them on, a protocol for how they should spend that period of time? Like, should they sit in silence? Can they be active during that time? Does it matter what the activity they're doing is during this duration for the study?
Well, it depends on which study, but those studies I was just talking about for 5 months and weeks at a time, no, people are going about their normal day.
Okay.
They're just doing what they do, and we're measuring how in sync are they with the Earth and each other and stuff in the groups. During a heart lock-in, it would be more like a 15-minute kind of heart-focused meditation. So yeah, in that case, they're sitting still and
Okay.
doing the thing, but that's just during that period. But really, HeartMath is all about, and the core tools, techniques that we teach people, is really all about how do we self-regulate especially our emotional world, our emotional diet, in real time, in day-to-day life, right? So we have one kind of technique that you would consider more of a heart-focused meditation, but most of the other, I would say 8 core techniques are really about how do we navigate day-to-day life while maintaining our energetic coherence and our composure and reducing the drama and the significance, because it's our emotions, unmanaged emotions, that really drain our energy. That's my main 30 years of research on that. That's very, I can prove that one pretty clearly and published a lot on it. So it's the anger and anxiety and impatience, the things that we take for granted that are really driving the activity in our nervous system, in our hormonal system. And that's really sucking the energy out of our systems in a way, and kind of wasting it. When we become more heart intelligent, more self-regulated from our larger self, we start seeing, well, wait a minute, I'm in traffic and I'm getting frustrated because it's not moving fast enough. All I'm doing is setting in motion at least 1,400 biochemical changes that drain energy. All right, traffic's not going to move any faster. Why don't I use a technique here and use that time to get coherent and get in sync? Right?
Yeah.
Things like that. They're very practical, simple. They're very practical and simple, but you've got to usually have some type of meaningfulness and for most people, it usually has to start, have a self come out. I'm going to do this because I'll have more energy at the end of the day, or I'll get better golf scores, or that's how it starts for a lot of people. And then once they start learning about coherence and getting coherent, it becomes that they start actually getting connected more with their larger self. And then they start doing it more out of their own intelligence, the self-regulating, managing their energy. And then the body, we have that energy that we've saved through wasting it, squandering it, if you will, to self-heal, to regenerate the body, the physical systems, but to especially then to start connecting more deeper with ourself at a deeper level, which starts elevating our own awareness and consciousness, which then we start becoming more inclusive and more intuitive and living more in that kind of, like for me, synchronicities is a way of life. I mean, it's not like they're some magical thing. I now expect them.
Right. Yeah.
No, I do. I mean, I know they're going to happen if I maintain that kind of inner flow state. So,
Totally agree. Absolutely 100% with that. And I think it's interesting because I think I love that you guys are putting tools out there to help people on this path, because I think it's so important be, to recognize that it is a practice. It is a practice. It's not something you switch on the switch and all of a sudden you're in this coherent state all the time, every day, every moment. It's a practice that you get to. And it's like these simple steps that you can take along the way. But once you find them, then you realize and you see those triggers out there and you recognize that I'm being triggered right now. And, it's like, okay, so let me harness the tools I've been working and practicing on so much to rein that back in, because those emotions, like you said, and all of the after effects of those, and all, from a physiological perspective, what it's doing to us. Not only is it doing us to us, but what we're doing to ourselves, we're doing to other people.
exactly what we're feeding the field now, right? So
Yeah.
it's really, so that's what I would usually end by is an invitation to our listeners to really stop and do an inner kind of check and ask yourself, what am I feeding the field? Am I really feeding the field, literal, measurable frequencies, vibrations of kindness, right? Compassion, appreciation, calm, or am I feeding the field frequencies of anxiety and fear and resentment and impatient? Because it matters. And if you find yourself maybe, feeding the field some of those frequencies that aren't so helpful for your own health and others, make a shift. Go to the heart. Actually focus your energy in the heart. We call it heart-focused breathing. You have to breathe anyway, right? So it doesn't take any more time out of your day, but you really pretend you're breathing through the area of the heart, right? Breathe a little slower and deeper than normal. And then try and activate a feeling of appreciation or care for someone in your life or something you care about, and radiate that into the field.
And people can learn about these different techniques through HeartMath, correct?
Well, that's what we primarily do, so.
Yeah.
HeartMath.org is a great place. A lot of free resources on our website.
Yeah. And there's two HeartMaths, a heartmath.com and a heartmath.org,
Right.
connected but two separate things.
Right. Same mission, but different. So the heartmath.org is research and public education, and we also work with schools and veterans and law enforcement. The other more nonprofit focused areas, where the .com is more commercial sales and companies, things like that. So.
Okay. And I know we are getting very close on time here. Can I just ask you, so the GCI, which we've been talking about, which is the collective consciousness that you have been talking about measuring.
Which stands for Global Coherence Initiative, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, I was getting ready to add that, but
I'm sure you were, sorry.
Appreciate you jumping in with that. So you had mentioned these devices that are set up all over the place. Is that the same thing as a random number generator?
No.
No. Okay.
So what I'm talking about, the Global Coherence monitoring system, these are very expensive, hard to do actually. These are some of them. These are ultra sensitive magnetometers.
Okay.
They're literally measuring the magnetic activity of Earth.
Okay.
And both the field line resonances and the Schumann resonances, and they're quite expensive to do and kind of a big deal to find locations. Now, random number generators, which that's you're referring to there, is what's called the Global Consciousness Project, GCP, not GCI, and that was started by Dr. Roger Nelson, probably close to 23 years ago at Princeton. And I think of it as a globally distributed scientific instrument, but they're basically little devices that kind of inexpensive that you plug into a computer and send a string of random numbers back to a central server. And over 20 years now, what that network has shown is that when an event happens that triggers a large number of people into a similar emotion, that this global network of physical devices that is very carefully designed to be completely random stops being as random. A coherence of sorts is somehow introduced into this network globally, right? That's the key. It's a global effect that they change their behavior, so they become either more or less random from what's expected in response to human emotion. And it's clearly attention and emotion that affects these. Not you can sit around and try and mind bend like you're bending a spoon or something. That network doesn't care.
Okay.
It's emotion. And it's important to understand that these devices are based on the randomness is based on a process called quantum tunneling. So it's literally a quantum type, it's literally quantum tunneling that creates these noises. So something's interacting at this other energetic level to change the behavior. Now, I'm actually honored to say, you may not know this, that we've been asked to take over that project. So we're becoming the new home base for the Global Consciousness Project as well. And for about the last year, I've been working with Dr. Nelson and another team, for some people from IONS and other folks on my team and from around the world. And we're asking questions about, okay, here's what we've learned. here's what didn't maybe work so well, what would make it better. So we were designing a new version called GCP 2.0. It is a citizen scientist project that people can if they want to host one of these devices, and we're going to make it very easy and really expand this. I think we can expand the number of devices out there by many times and have a much more sensitive network to detect these global effects, because one of the things that's been done many times, and we're doing now, is when like global peace days and large concerts and things get involved, to really bring more people into adding, positive energy, if you will, positive information, love, care, compassion into the energetic field of the Earth. How can we measure that? Or is it having an effect? And this is a network that actually can measure that. So.
Well, thank you very much for clarifying the difference between the two and the goals of each. I appreciate that. And is there any, I know time-wise, I know we are there and I want to honor your time. Is there anything you would like to add before we wrap up?
Add heart. I've been getting to be an old fart, and well, I am. Been through a lot of different practices and different things over the years. A lot of meditate. I mean, I did years ago, back in the 80s, really. The chanting and the long meditations and all that, and the different practices of mindfulness, and then into HeartMath, which was what really moved me. I would say more. When I discovered the heart, actually, I made more personal gains, I can honestly say, in 3 months than I did in 15 years of those kind of practices. Not that I didn't get a lot of benefit out of them, don't get me wrong. And that's why I kind of walked away from my own multi-million-dollar company to help Doc Childrey, the founder of HeartMath, really get HeartMath started and off the ground. But that's really off topic. What I would say I've learned, in a lot of my friends and colleagues, is that the most effective way, the fast track, if you will, to really connecting with our larger self is simply remembering to literally broadcast love, radiate love. That takes us into coherence. We literally emit more light, photons, and it's one of the quickest ways to connect with our larger self, which is what elevates our awareness and our consciousness. So it's remembering to do that as much as you can during the daytime or anytime. Think of it, in between times. Right? In between calls, in between interviews, just practice radiating love.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you very much for leaving us with that.
Yeah, because that's what we're feeding the field, and that's what the planet really, because it really does matter what we feed the field, and that helps others wake up.
Yeah, well, I think it sounds like you are paving a path and giving us the tools where we can remember who we are. Remember who we are, because I think we all came from that place of love. So it's just tapping and finding our way back home.
Yep.
So yeah, and that's why we called the documentary Going Home, because I think the home is the home, and the home is not a structure or building, it's within in that connection. So yeah, thank you for sharing your time and your energy today and all of your work, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, and everyone have a great day.